operator. I forgot. Smooth operator.
One of Formula One's current best drivers is making a drastic change from a top team at Ferrari to a team barely fighting for points at Williams. The cars will be completely different and it will be quite the change for the Spanish driver. Carlos has driven many different cars and has adapted quite well to a lot of them. Will his driving style help the team move up, or will it hinder his performance when first joining the revitalized Williams team? To find out, we have to talk about Carlos Sainz's unique driving style, and will it work with this very peaky and hard to control Williams? Right before getting into the video, I wanted to thank you guys for the support on the channel. Amazing as always. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. But let's get into it with this Carlos Sainz Williams video. Carlos has a very particular driving style on the grid, and it's always been different to many of his teammates. He's one of those drivers that uses a style that very little on the grid still use. And the basics of that is understeer, but there's much more to understand with this style that helps him out and what makes him such a good driver with all these cars that he's driven. The McLaren was a great example of him adapting to a car that always had inherent understeer, and a lot of drivers had a very hard time finding a way to extract a lot of performance out of that car. Daniel Ricciardo is your perfect example, but Carlos got to grips with that car very quickly, and while Lando was a rookie, he was automatically putting points in him and beat him in both seasons being together. He also did a very good job while at Toro Rosso against Max Verstappen, and while that isn't talked about too much because Max was the better out of the two, he was very close a lot of times, but that car was very adaptable to both styles. It wasn't a very particular car like the Red Bull or the McLaren per se. The only team that gave him a bit of difficulty was the Renault, specifically driving with Hulk, because their styles are very different, and the Renault car was actually a bit peaky in comparison to the other cars he's driven. But obviously, going off of the data that we currently have, these new Ferrari cars that he's driven from 21 to 24, sadly now he's going to Williams, we've gotten a great understanding of what he prefers in a car, especially because his teammate is a bit of the opposite. When actually speaking about it, a quote from Carlos himself is, "I prefer a car that understeers than a car that oversteers. Why? Because my driving is really aggressive. When I'm out on track, I know everybody calls me the smooth operator, but I can make my car rotate like I turn the car myself with the steering wheel and the pedals. I know how to make the car turn. You give me an understeer car and don't worry, I will make it turn." Obviously, Carlos gives us some insight on what goes through his head while he's driving and how he likes to use his inputs while going through a lap on whatever track it is. The only other driver on the grid that really likes understeer is Alonso. You have drivers like Lewis who prefers a bit of understeer, but both these drivers, in comparison to everybody else, kind of like to drive a bit of a boat. Using the pedals to turn does require a lot more turn in on certain corners, and you lose that advantage in those slow speed corners, but in high speed corners, he's very effective, and that's usually where he had a bit of an advantage on that of Charles Leclerc. Both were aggressive, but one was understeering while the other one was oversteering. And two of these years in Ferrari are perfect examples of when Charles' style actually ended up working better, and then there's also an example of when Carlos' style worked better. 2022, as we started these underfloor regulations, it was Charles that was on top, and the car had a bit of oversteer with it. It was more on the nose, it was what Charles preferred, and while both do drive aggressively, Carlos talks a lot about the beginning of the season being very difficult for him and hard to understand a car with this much front end grip, and it was definitely him having to adapt his style to drive the 2022 car, which led them into 2023 into making a more balanced car, but also a very tricky car to drive. The first half of the season, the car was made in a way that it was so hard to understand. The rear end was kicking out constantly, but as we ended up getting to Zandvoort that second half of the season, Carlos told the team, "Let's try a setup that I've been wanting from the beginning." They finally ended up going through with it, and the car performed much better. And they explained this setup to pretty much be like a fake understeer, meaning the car wasn't understeer itself, but they set the car up in a way where there would be some inherent understeer for the drivers to have more confidence. And Carlos really shined in these races. It's actually where we ended up seeing his Singapore win, the only non-Red Bull victory in 2023. And we saw Leclerc a bit on the back end. It was only like a tenth or two, which was quite impressive by himself. But it came to show when the car was set up for Carlos in a understeer style, we saw the best of him where he was able to use the pedals to turn and really show off the pace that the guy really had. We ended up seeing how successful this was in 24 when the car was both balanced for understeer and oversteer because both drivers had their moments. Carlos had his Mexico, Leclerc had his Coda. The car was great in 2024 and both drivers were able to be very confident at the wheel. But what makes the Williams so hard to drive? Will it be difficult for Carlos to adapt to this peaky car? When I say the car is peaky, I mean that it's a very front-oriented car. Something that drivers that like oversteer will talk about the car being more on the nose and having more confidence on the nose, being able to actually end up catching the rear, which is something that Carlos can do, but he prefers not to have this. There are benefits to this oversteering style, specifically in qualifying, you're able to extract a lot of pace if you're able to make the most out of the rear end being loose. In races, this can be an issue as the tires can grain and deteriorate much harder through the race if you are not consistent in this style. Max is a great example of somebody that can smoothly run this oversteering style. Charles does prefer a bit of aggression, but he uses that mainly in qualifying and then switches his style in the race, while Carlos has always liked a little bit of understeer. It doesn't really do well in high speed. That has been a problem with this Williams car since the beginning. You add any type of wind or any unpredictable conditions, this car loses a lot of downforce and becomes a very tricky car to drive, which is something that Carlos has never really loved. Going along with that, this car is always low on downforce. It helps on tracks like Monza, but it takes away on tracks like Monaco, which they actually ended up having a decent one in 2024, so there are hopes of this car becoming better. The Williams has been tricky ever since this underfloor era. I mean, it was pretty bad even in the previous era of regulations. But it takes time to adapt to this car. Alex has actually done a very good job in this car. He's had a bit of bad luck in 2024, but overall pretty solid since he stepped into this Williams team. It's been moving up and up in the grid, at least when it comes to performance, maybe not in the standings. But the car itself is becoming more balanced, which should suit Carlos as he ends up sitting into it. So will it actually work with Carlos joining Williams in 2025? Well, on the current trajectory that they have, this should suit Carlos, and I fully believe that he's one of the most adaptable drivers on the grid. I think him and Alonso alike, they have that Spanish bond and just end up working in a lot of the cars. And I've already stated multiple examples. He's driven both oversteery cars and understeery cars and performed very well in them. And while it might take a little bit of time, whether that's 5 or 6 races like it took in 2022, maybe even a little bit more, he ends up catching up to his teammate and then doing a very great job for the rest of the season. His style is adaptable and his speed is always there. So with this Williams car, I do think it's going to take a little bit of time for him to settle in, be able to drive a bit of a more oversteery car as the front end on this Williams is very strong. And that seems to be the trend with all Mercedes cars with the exception of the McLaren. The Aston and the Mercedes were also having big time problems when it came to having a very strong front end, but the rear was really just not working in these cars. Williams has it to the most extreme. That is mainly why they're at the end of the grid typically. And we see so many crashes because this car, to extract the most pace out of it, requires you to be very confident. And if you make the smallest of mistakes, it can result in some very big money at the end of the year. So adaptability is going to be the biggest game here. I do believe he's going to get over this problem car because it really has been an issue for a lot of drivers. As we saw, Colapinto got the grips too, but it was still very crashy. Alex crashed a lot in 2024, even with the car being a bit balanced. Logan, sure, he's not the greatest example, but he did crash the car a lot. Latifi. In these past recent seasons, even George Russell himself has had a lot of struggle with this Williams car, but I do believe Carlos Sainz is the guy to get it done. Any team he's joined, whether that be McLaren, Renault, Ferrari, he has made the teams better. His input and feedback is extremely impressive, and it's something that's very underrated about a driver like Carlos Sainz. A lot of his engineers have spoken about him being very technical in his mindset, similar to that of a Sebastian Vettel. So this will become very useful for a team that's further down and needs a bit of help, especially in that technical department. I'd love to hear your thoughts on in the comments below. Carlos Sainz is a great driver, and I fully believe this Williamson is going to go great. Alex Albon has a tough challenge ahead of him. Love to hear your thoughts on in the comments below. Please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world, and peace.